Chapter 41, Devoid of All Purpose. Toward the end of 2006, Vicky's landlord unexpectedly told her that he was selling his property and that she would unfortunately have to find herself another place. However, he said he owned other properties in Woodland and that if she was interested, he could get her into one of his apartment complexes out there. She really didn't want to move out of San Jose because of our visits, but due to her having credit problems and a deficient rental history, she wasn't left with much choice. She got lucky finding the condo in Campbell, but in the end, I was finally able to convince her to jump on the guy's offer and move to Woodland. I really wanted her to move back to Ukiah, but Woodland was closer than San Jose. Aside from getting close to having heart surgery, Vicky began to get sick a lot more, and it really started to worry me. My biggest fear was her being alone during one of those times when she may need medical attention and nobody was there to help her. When we talk on the phone, sometimes she'd start coughing uncontrollably, and this was something I'd never heard before. It wasn't a regular cough either. It was a deep, dry cough that seemed to be a sign of something wrong in her body. After pleading with her to see a doctor, Vicky was told that she had fluid leaking from her heart and that it was now building up in her lungs. They said her heart was also becoming enlarged. I didn't know that much about this condition called chronic edema, but I didn't need to be an expert to know that it was serious. After Vicky got settled into her new place in Woodland, I called her one time and she sounded terrible. She was crying, telling me that she had a headache so bad that it was making her nauseous. It was killing me to hear her going through this alone, and I felt like a part of me was being forced to sit back and listen to my wife die in front of me. There was nothing I could do but try to comfort her. Here I was, her biggest protector, locked up and powerless to do anything except listen. I was definitely failing her when she needed me the most. During our call, she started coughing so intensely that we couldn't finish the call. As soon as the phone hung up, I called my mom in Daly City and told her to call the paramedics in Woodland and to have them go to Vicky's apartment. It was already late, so I couldn't even call back. Not knowing what happened for the rest of the night was heart-wrenching. The following morning, I tried calling her, but Vicky didn't answer. She usually always answered, so this worried me even more. I continued calling her into the evening, and then she finally answered. When she got on the phone, her first words were, "Don't worry, babe, I'm okay." They had admitted her into the hospital, and she still sounded groggy. But throughout this whole ordeal, her biggest concern was having her cell phone brought to her, knowing that I'd be worried. She said, you almost lost me last night, but they brought me back." I knew her health problems were dire and serious, but a part of me really didn't want to believe that it had gotten that bad, to the point of actually losing her. She said her blood pressure dropped so low she actually died for a minute, but the doctors were able to bring her back. Then she told me something that still sticks with me until this day, something I'll never forget. Vicky said that when she was still half conscious, after arriving at the hospital, she remembered the doctor standing over her, removing her necklace. She used to wear a thin gold chain with a small gold crucifix that she never took off. I remember her removing it one time the entire time we were together, only to get the clasp fixed. She said when the doctors removed it, she told them to make sure that they gave it to me because she wanted me to have it. I couldn't believe what she was telling me. It was hard just imagining that at that moment, she must have thought that she'd never see me again. After this, I told her that I didn't want her to go back to Woodland by herself. There was no way I'd let her be alone after this. I told her that she needed to stay with her mom, at least for a couple weeks. Luckily, her mom was also there at the hospital and insisted that Vicky go back home with her. Otherwise, Vicky's stubbornness probably would have taken her back to Woodland. After she was released from the hospital, Vicky reluctantly drove back to Ukiah with her mom and stayed with her mom and her mom's boyfriend. Even though I was still worried about everything that was happening, knowing that she was surrounded by family managed to bring me a small measure of comfort. Meanwhile, by the beginning of 2007, everyone that was indicted with me had pled out and jumped on deals. Joe and I were the only two facing life sentences under the 3 strikes law, and were the only two left. John, Roger, Jose, Thug Love, Chata, and Barbara all took suspended sentences with probation. Most of them had a minimal amount of involvement, so I wasn't surprised that they all got good deals and avoided prison. Twist took 2 years with 1 strike. Sykes took 6 years with 2 strikes. Baby G took 12 years with 2 strikes, and Pony took 16 years with 2 strikes. Baby G and Pony were the last 2 to get sentenced. and both left sometime in the beginning of 2007. After Baby G left, Looney, Thavo, and another NR member by the name of Frank Manos Gutierrez all moved down to 2nd East with us. By this time, I'd been back on an active tier for close to 6 months and was pretty much being embraced by everyone on the tier. Technically, I was still on freeze, but it was almost as if everyone down there had completely either lost sight of this or they just didn't care anymore. But this was due, in part, to intentionally keeping a lot of these guys off balance with deceptive tactics to keep them individually manipulated. I worked on disarming each one of them individually, gradually building rapport up and down the tier. I had to make as many allies as I could and gain as much stability within the jail as possible. DB was anticipating getting released on his appeal, so once he left, my ability to maneuver and jostle depended on how much loyalty I was able to win over. He was my biggest supporter, but once he was gone, I needed to maintain some of that support, and the homeboys on the tier were my best chance. Some of these guys were polished NR members with stout schooling, but they were slowly being infiltrated, and I don't even think they knew it. I had to play my hand and be shrewd, otherwise I'd be like a fish out of water. In addition, I was also making 2-gallon batches of wine every week for all the homeboys on the tier. In the beginning, this started out as a luxury, to watch football and for enjoyment purposes, but for me, it became another deceptive tool. I usually wouldn't have made it every week because this stuff wreaks havoc on the liver, but it served as a valuable purpose, and the pros definitely outweighed the cons. It was literally like sodium pentothal, truth serum. These guys were already loose with their business, but after they were full of my wine, it was like opening up the floodgates. They used absolutely no discretion whatsoever. Since DB was getting close to being released, my main concern was what would happen once he paroled, and if Lencho, Charlie, Sammy, or Kramer pulled up. If a contingency plan wasn't set in place, it would have left me completely exposed without any real chance of averting those who opposed me. I wanted to know what type of recourse or safeguards DB was planning to devise before he left. I knew Lencho never stayed out too long, so the possibility of him coming back in was a real one. Whenever I go out to the yard with DB, I started pressing him to begin taking countermeasures in the event this happened. He told me he would personally touch base with Lencho and advise him to cease speaking on me and to cease sticking his nose where it didn't belong. He said he'd also advise him that this was per Chuco's directives and that my situation was already being looked into. He said if he wasn't able to locate him, he would leave the RC position to Stretch with specific instructions not to allow them to interfere with the investigation or to make any decisions about my status, and that he was personally dealing with it. But realistically, I knew that this was a flawed and ineffective stratagem because Stretch was only an NR member and couldn't defy another C like that. Regardless, DB wasn't authorized to bestow that degree of authority to Stretch. He'd be setting Stretch up, and in all likelihood, he'd be sending him on a kamikaze mission. If any of these C's came into the jail in order to green light on me, Stretch couldn't say nothing about it. No NR member can hold rank over any C, no matter what the circumstances are. Stretch would get shredded up and deemed himself. As unreasonable as it was, that's exactly what DB did, and I couldn't say or do much about it. All I could do was only hope that he would get out and take care of it with these other C's himself before it came down to any of this. Kramer ended up catching a parole violation and came into the jail before DB left. Initially, he was put on the 4th floor, but eventually moved down to 2nd East with us. They moved him 2 doors down from DB. When Kramer hit the tier, I really didn't go out of my way to reach out to him. I kept my distance, similar to how I treated Joe when he moved to South Max. I knew that DB would address everything that needed to be, so I sat back and let him take care of it. I wanted to confront Kramer myself, but I bit my tongue and never said nothing about what DB told me. It wouldn't have put me in a better position, and there was nothing to gain, so I just left it alone. Around this same time, one of my regimental members, Patrick Turtle Martinez, also came into the jail and moved on the tier. Turtle was out on bail for another case, but according to him, he had been remanded for what he claimed was a failure to appear. Later, I'd find out the real reason, but that's what I was told at the time. While Kramer was still there, DB was gearing up to take over the regiment on the streets. In doing so, they started discussing a lot of details openly on the tier. Kramer was expecting to be gone for at least a year, so DB was going to go out there, locate his manpower, and pick up where he left off. When it came to riding kites, DB was real lazy, so he baited Kramer into discussing all his business on the wire, openly amongst others. By this time, DB was also grooming Stretch to take over the RC position once he left. Everything had been turned over to Stretch, but DB was still acting as an overseer to ensure the transition went smoothly. Stretch, on the other hand, assigned Looney and Manos to act as his buffers and tasked them with reading, screening, and securing the entire household's mail, consisting of rosters of the members in the jail, NA reports, ongoing investigations, follow-up reports, directives, B&Ls, and other miscellaneous paperwork that pertained to the jail's activities and some of the street regiments. Looney and Manos were my neighbors directly to my right. Whenever they go out to the yard, to the shower, or any type of other off-tier movement, they'd slide me their contraband that was usually packed in a lunchbox. Aside from pens, razors, lighters, and other items, they'd also send me all the kites they were holding as well. I was surprised the first time they did this, but it became a regular routine. Needless to say, this was strictly against protocol since I was on freeze. However, I'd gained so much of their trust that they completely disregarded security and broke all the policies. Normally, I wouldn't have popped open the box and meddled into the household's business, as it wouldn't have been necessary. But because I was on freeze and had so many people working against me, this became a perfect opportunity for me to gather critical information. Everything pertaining to Kramer's regiment, including the identity of his manpower, who owed fines, who owed money for drugs, what they were involved in, communications to his channel in the Bay, identity of associates who were assisting, phone numbers, and other vital pieces of information were all there. Similar information about Lenchel's regiment, Sammy's regiment, and other street affairs were also in there. I read through as much of it as I could and made mental notes of it all. But what I was really looking for was any and all information that pertained directly to me. Within 3 weeks after Kramer hit the tier, he was transferred out to Santa Rita for his parole violation. A couple weeks later, after he caught the bus, DB was released and also went home. But before he paroled, he assured me that he would touch base with Lenchel as soon as he got out, and he'd also have Chuco send word to Charlie and Sammy to keep their mouths shut. A few days later, after DB left, the tier officers came in during the middle of the night and moved Turtle. As Turtle was moving, I asked him where he was going, but he said he didn't know. Something about the way he answered raised a red flag and led me to believe this was planned. The whole move seemed real fishy, but the following morning, we found out that they moved him to PC. I'd later find out that the real reason Turtle came back stemmed from his getting caught up during his Romero hearing. During the hearing, Agent Livingston unexpectedly showed up and provided the DA with harmful information arguing why his Romero hearing should be denied. The information that Livingston provided pertained to Turtle's involvement in my regiment and indicated that he was an unindicted co-conspirator. Turtle then took the stand in his own defense, attempting to clean it up, but in the process, he made several incriminating admissions and implicated me. As a result of his admissions, Livingston filed charges against Turtle and used his statements to make a case. A few weeks after Turtle was moved, Jerry Bones Chavez was released from the county jail after finishing his county time. Within a few days, Looney, Stretch, and Mono started blowing up his phone, making three-way calls. An inmate places a call, then that call is passed on to a third party. Prior to Bones leaving, he told us that he was going to hook up a burnout phone so we could call him and make three-way calls. A burnout phone is the use of a phone with money from stolen credit cards credited to the billing account. Money can continue to be added to the account until the credit card company tracks the card and shuts off the phone. One day, when I had the phone in front of my cell, Looney gave me Bones' number and told me to call him so I could three-way DB and follow up on the issues with Lenchel. After talking to DB and finding out that he had yet to get in touch with Lenchel, Bones asked me if I wanted to make another call. At first, I declined, but something told me to call Vicky. At the time, Vicky hadn't been able to put any money on her phone, so it had been about 3 weeks since I last talked to her. After he dialed Vicky's mom's number, she answered and we talked for almost 15 minutes. She sounded better than she had during our calls a few weeks prior, but by this time they had her on dialysis once a day to help her kidneys flush out the fluid still building up in her lungs. Vicky said she was still fighting, but was always tired after these treatments. Other than that, she said she was okay. Then came the ominous warning that she began to tell me on a more frequent basis. You better hurry up and get home, Boxer, because I don't know how much longer I'm gonna be around. It really hurt and bothered me to hear Vicky talk like this, especially now that her words took on an eerie sense of urgency, an urgency that made me very uneasy. Toward the end of our call, we told each other I love you, and I said I'd call her again in a few days. The following day after talking with Vicky, Gang Intel's Officer Dela Cruz came onto the tier and walked straight to my cell. He said, "Hey, I need to talk to you." I asked, "About what?" He said, "I can't tell you right here. I need to pull you out." I looked at him and shook my head as if to say, "You're fronting me off, and you can't just pull me out of an active tier like this." When I was in Little Max, it didn't matter and wasn't an issue. But this looked suspicious, especially after everything I was going through. I told him, "You can tell me whatever it is right here on the tier. What is it?" But again, Dela Cruz insisted that I come out and talk with him downstairs. This was very uncharacteristic for him because I knew he understood the position he was putting me in, but I was still at an impasse. At first, I was going to refuse, but finally agreed to be cuffed up and pulled out. When I was escorted off the tier, he took me downstairs to the basement and walked me into the ODR, the same room I was brought to when Bob Messer and the FBI tried to flip me a few months prior. As soon as we sat down, Dela Cruz looked at me with a long pause and said, "I'm sorry I gotta be the one to tell you this, but Vicky passed away this morning." I looked back at him trying to digest what he just said. I couldn't process it. I didn't want to. My mind started spinning and I suddenly felt sick. Dela Cruz said, "Go ahead, man, let it out." And that's exactly what I did. I broke all the way down. As I was sitting there trying my best not to let myself fall all the way apart, Dela Cruz got up, removed my cuffs, and then sat back down across from me. When I finally looked over at him, he was staring down at the floor. I felt like I had just been victimized. My entire life had been shaken to the core in those few short minutes. My emotions were mixed. I felt guilt for not being there with her and for possibly causing it. I felt anger for being caged up and stranded. I felt hopelessness for not knowing what I was going to do. And I felt devoid of all purpose for losing the one person I cared about the most in this whole world. After I was able to somewhat compose myself, I looked at Dela Cruz and said, "Now I'm just going to plead out. Fuck it. I'm ready to go." I felt like there was nothing left for me out there and that life would never hold the same meaning for me ever again. It crushed me. If there was ever a time in my life when I felt like giving up, this was definitely it. Dela Cruz stepped outside of his job for a few brief minutes and extended his hand as a friend. He told me to take a couple days to gather my thoughts before I decided to start making those kind of decisions. Then he asked me a question that shattered my resolve and continues to be the source of all my motivation. Dela Cruz said, "Do you think Vicky would have wanted you to give up and see you spend the rest of your life in prison? Or do you think she would have wanted you to keep all your promises and continue going forward in life for the both of you?" Dela Cruz got me at that moment, and he knew it. He had completely disarmed me with that one single question, and at that time, I didn't know where it would take me. Then he said, "You got an emergency visit waiting for you. 2 of your aunts showed up to see you. They weren't going to let them in, but I pulled some strings for you. It was my father's sisters, Donna and Shirley. They had never visited me in jail, but this was definitely an exception. Needless to say, it was a very emotional visit that only made everything that much more of a reality. Their support that day was immeasurable. When I was finally escorted back to my cell, I wrote a quick OTR off the tier report, letting Stretch know where I went and a brief summary about what happened. I spent the next 3 sleepless nights and days thinking about every memory, every minute, and every smile that I ever shared with Vicky. My thoughts were completely consumed with her. It took me close to a week before I was able to pull myself together enough to even start talking on the tier again. Later, in an emotional letter her mother wrote me, I finally found out the details of what occurred. During the last week of Vicky's life, her mom wrote that in retrospect, she realized that Vicky must have known she was about to say goodbye. Vicky spent that last week doing things that were real uncharacteristic. She planted a rose garden in front of her mom's house. She had a deep sentimental conversation with her son, and she sent a text to her sister simply saying, "I love you, sis. Life's too short, so let's not be mad." Also, according to her mom, she believed that Vicky had actually waited for my last phone call. She told me that Vicky was real excited the last time I called, and sensed that this was something she was waiting for. The following morning, after her dialysis appointment, they went to breakfast together and then returned home. Vicky told her she was going to go lay down and take a nap, and that this was the last time that they talked. About an hour later, she went to wake Vicky and she was gone. I was guilt-ridden for a long time after this because deep down, I felt like Vicky let go, believing that I was never going to come back again. Her sister also wrote a letter after Vicky passed. She asked if I knew where Vicky's necklace was, since they looked everywhere and couldn't find it. Months later, when her mom was cleaning her own room, she found it hidden amongst her things. Vicky had hid her necklace in her mom's room before lying down, as if she had a premonition, knowing that Vicky knew her time was near. As she removed her necklace, continues to tug at my heart to this day.